Hi, folks. Today we're going to talk about logical fallacies. Logical fallacies are cute. They're fun. So when we discussed logic, we discussed what it means to be valid, sound, and consistent. Valid is if the premise is true, then the conclusion must be true. Sound means the argument is valid and the premise is true. And consistent means it is possible for everything to be true. If an argument is valid, sound, and consistent, we consider the conclusions true. Well, what if somebody doesn't care about the truth? And so suppose that you are paid to try to convince people that a truth is actually a falsehood, or that you have an unprovable belief that you wish to support, or that somebody is trying to convince you of a lie and you want to protect yourself. Logical fallacies are a way of dismissing the truth, either intentionally or unintentionally. And so a logical fallacy is an invalid or faulty reasoning in the construction of an argument. They are sometimes done unintentionally in trying to find the truth. Somebody takes a shorthand or bad conclusions are reached. They're sometimes done intentionally, though, for the purpose of malice, ignorance, or deception. Frequently, somebody thinks they are doing what's right, and bad conclusions are a result. This happens a lot. Here's a silly example. My family has always believed potatoes cure the common cold. My community has always believed potatoes cure the common cold. I have witnessed people who eat potatoes and get better from the common cold. I have witnessed people who don't eat potatoes and get worse from the common cold. Therefore, potatoes cure the common cold. It's a great story, but it's not the truth. And so there's nothing that actually leads us to say that potatoes are a cure for the common cold. When we try and classify logical fallacies, there are hundreds of different types of logical fallacies. We're going to go into a bunch of them. And generally, they're going to fall into two different forms. The first is a formal fallacy. Formal fallacies are fallacies in which the logic itself is wrong. They're invalid arguments where the premise could be true, but the conclusion could still be false. Here's an example. There are an infinite number of even numbers, and there are an infinite number of odd numbers. With an infinite number of each, we conclude that there must be at least one number which is both even and odd. Clearly, that is not true. This is saying there's an infinite number of things, but that does not guarantee that something can be both even and odd. Informal fallacies are fallacies in which the issue isn't necessarily in the form, but instead focuses more on the language, content, or context. These often appear true and require more critical thinking to determine the truth. As an example, students who fail math classes are less likely to graduate. And so the best option is to remove mathematics from the curriculum. There's subjective language used here. At first, this seems like a reasonable solution, but it's certainly not the truth of the situation. Now, when we start discussing logical fallacy, there are two schools of thought on how we can use them. And so we can use logical fallacies to seek the truth. If somebody is lying or manipulating, it is important to recognize the signs. And so in knowing some of the core logical fallacies, we can recognize when they are being used and ignore or confront those arguments. We know what truth is. We find it on the truth table. And so that's where we can always go back. That's the whole purpose of logic, to say, well, this is what it means for something to be true. And when somebody tries to deviate from that reality, you may wish to call them out on it. That said, the other school of thought is that we can use logical fallacies to tell lies. And so sometimes you need to be the one doing the manipulating. Is it morally wrong? Sure, but the ends justify the means. In the court of public opinion, what is true often does not matter. And that's just the reality. Sometimes to fight for the truth, you have to use some underhanded tricks. And so let's learn a few. As I mentioned, there are many types of fallacies. We're not going to explore all of them, but I encourage you to do a more thorough search on them because they're fun. More than anything else, do it because they are fun to look into. We will go through a collection of some of the more common and interesting examples. And to explore them, we're actually going to use a dialogue. A dialogue is where you have two people who are communicating with one another. And we're going to go with the classical example of Socrates and his student Plato, as was done in old times. And so a straw man fallacy is when you misrepresent somebody's argument to make it easier to attack. And so here's the example of Socrates. I think it's important for students to learn mathematics. Plato would say, that's interesting. I disagree. I find it far more important for students to learn language skills. After all, without words, how do you even name the numbers? And so there's our straw man. We're changing what the argument actually is. The slippery slope fallacy asserts that if we allow for something to happen, it may lead to something far more drastic happening. Socrates, we should teach students how to count numbers. Plato, teaching students to count is a dangerous game. Pretty soon, they'll be counting cards, gambling in the street. You'll turn them all into criminals or worse, tax collectors. Special pleading. A special pleading fallacy occurs when it's decided that the truth doesn't apply in a particular case for some unrelated reason. Socrates, I think all people should have a basic understanding of mathematics. Plato, I agree, but I don't think I personally need to know any math. I mean, it is unlikely that I will ever use math, so I'm good. The gambler's fallacy. The gambler's fallacy is the belief that independent random events are somehow based on past events. Socrates, I just flipped a coin 10 times and it landed on heads 10 times. Plato, the next one's gotta be tails. The odds of getting 11 in a row is 0.04%. It's impossible. In fact, the odds are 50% still. False dilemma fallacy. The false dilemma fallacy is the statement that there are only two options when there are many other options. Socrates, is your favorite number a rational number or an irrational number? Plato, joke's on you. My favorite number is the Gaussian integer 3 plus I. Can you believe that it's not even a prime? False equivalence. A false equivalence fallacy occurs when two statements are described as the same when they're not the same. Socrates, why are you trying to put the square block into the round hole? Plato, it's okay, I measured them. The square block and cylinder block have the same volume, so it should fit. I just have to find the right angle. In reality, that doesn't work. The ad hominem fallacy. The ad hominem fallacy is where instead of addressing the argument, the other arguer's character is challenged. Socrates, I believe mathematics is important for the common person. Plato, you also don't worship the gods and were arrested for corruption of minors. I don't think you should be considered a moral authority on such things. Loaded questions. The loaded questions fallacy is an argument that includes assumptions which imply some wrongdoing. Socrates, we all know that you hate children, but even you must agree that depriving them of mathematics is a punishment too great. Plato, first of all, I don't hate children. Socrates, got it, wink. The appeal to the majority. So the appeal to the majority fallacy is a statement that something is true because a majority of people in a group believe it to be true or good. Socrates, I went to the meeting of the Pythagoreans the other day, and you know how they love their beans and music? I told them if elected, I would make beans the national instrument. Plato, they are the musical fruit. Yeah, drum roll. Begging the question. And so the begging the question fallacy is one where we use the conclusion to justify the premise. And so this is something that happened to poor Socrates. Socrates, I am to be executed. Plato, what did you do? Socrates, they told me Zeus is kind and just, and we know this because Zeus is generous and all-knowing. I told them their logic begs the question of how they know he's generous and all-knowing. Yeah, that'll do it. The appeal to authority fallacy. And so the appeal to authority fallacy occurs when a person claims that because of their position of authority, they must be correct. Socrates. As the teacher, I think it would be better to switch the numbers and the shapes. Instead of using the number 2, we could just draw a rectangle. We could make 3 a triangle, 4 a square, and 5 a pentagon. Plato, you know best, teacher. Appeal to nature. The appeal to nature fallacy bases decisions on whether something is natural or not. Socrates. Pythagoras determined that there are numbers which are not rational. We should explore them to better understand numbers. Plato. No, thank you. Irrational numbers are weird, and it's probably immoral to study them. You can't even treat them as a standalone set. Pass. Composition. The fallacy of composition states that if something is true or true of the part, then it must be true of the whole. And so Socrates, I've checked all of the numbers through 10, and it looks like they all divide 2,520 evenly. I suspect that there is some number n such that all numbers go into it evenly. I'm calling it the Socratic number. Plato. Sounds reasonable as long as I don't have to find it. The fallacy of division is the opposite. The fallacy of division states that something which is true of an object must be true for all of its parts. Socrates. I've noticed that there are an infinite number of numbers. I believe this means that the natural numbers 1 through 100 is also infinite, but I'm having a hard time proving it. Plato, maybe you should try checking a smaller set. Anecdote. The fallacy of the anecdote is a statement of an event which may provide supporting evidence, but does not actually assert something as true or not. Socrates, do you believe the earth to be round or flat? Plato, it's obviously flat. We're sitting in the same room. The floor sure looks pretty flat. In fact, every room I've ever been in has had a flat floor. Appeal to emotion. The appeal to emotion fallacy can take many forms, but is always about manipulating the emotions of the audience. Socrates. I think the number 3 is greater than the number 2. Plato. You may think that, but I'm pretty sure the rest of us know the opposite is true, and they are the best audience in Athens. They're the most knowledgeable people that I know, so without a doubt, they know that you're wrong. Tu quoque. The tu quoque fallacy focuses on the idea that if the arguer's actions seem in opposition to a statement, the statement must be false. Do as I say, not as I do. That's what it is. Socrates. I think it's important for all people to go to school. Plato. You never went to school. Socrates. Details. The argument from ignorance fallacy. And so the argument from ignorance fallacy states that if something hasn't been proven false, then it must be true. And so Socrates. At my trial, I was accused of not believing in Zeus. I told them that just because there's lightning doesn't mean some guy in a robe is throwing it off a mountain. Plato, you need to flee the country. And if you don't know, Socrates, in fact, did not flee the country. You should probably Google him. Yeah, bad things happen to poor Socrates. No true Scotsman. So the appeal to purity fallacy, or the no true Scotsman fallacy, makes generalizations true by ignoring counterexamples. And so Socrates, why did you list the number 2 as a composite number? Plato, I've decided 2 must be a composite number. After all, any real prime number is odd, and 2 just doesn't fit in with that. The Texas sharpshooter. And so the Texas sharpshooter fallacy takes a cluster of data points and asserts a false claim to explain it. Socrates. After plotting all of the major crime, it looks like most of the crimes took place in the cities and not in the forests or countryside. Makes sense. City folks are notoriously dangerous. In reality, this is because trees and corn don't get arrested. The fallacy. And so the fallacy states that just because a fallacy has occurred doesn't necessarily mean that the conclusion is wrong. Socrates. I've decided that the earth is round. After all, if it's either flat or round, round makes more sense. Plato. That's a false dilemma. There are other options than round and flat. I think you're wrong and that we actually live on the surface of a donut. Argument from incredulity. Incredulity. An argument from incredulity, or fallacy, states that something is false because it sounds overly complicated or ridiculous. Socrates. I've been thinking on it, and I think all things are made of the same stuff. I'm calling them atoms. These atoms have particles with positive or negative charge, some without charge, and whenever we try to look at them, we change their behavior. Plato. Nah, Zeus is a much easier explanation. Equivocation. The equivocation fallacy involves using a word which has a double meaning and not specifying the intended meaning. Socrates. Why are you standing on a step stool? Plato. You told me if I was going to get anywhere in life, I'd need to climb a ladder. But genetic. A genetic fallacy occurs when a statement is judged based on its origin as opposed to from the current context. Socrates. Why do you choose not to use Roman numerals? They're far easier to write than Babylonian. Plato. Because I've known too many Romans. Middle ground. The middle ground fallacy states that from 2 opposing perspectives, the correct perspective will be somewhere in the middle. Socrates. I was checking your work. You said that 2 plus 2 is 8, but the correct answer is 4. Plato. Fine, let's call it 6 and be done with it. I'm entitled to my own opinion. The I'm entitled to my own opinion fallacy states that matters of fact can be subject to opinion. Socrates. We cannot just say that 2 plus 2 is 6. It is in fact that it is 4. Plato. You can believe what you want, and I'll believe what I want. Masked man fallacy. The masked man fallacy states that 2 things which have seemingly different properties cannot be the same. Socrates. The solution to the equation x plus 2 equals 3 is 1. What are you still working on it? Plato. Because it can't possibly be 1. X is a letter. 1 is a number. They're completely different. As a math teacher, I have had many students who have used this argument on me, and it breaks my heart. Continuum fallacy. The continuum fallacy states that a conclusion is wrong because there is a missing level of precision. Socrates. I'm thinking of a number greater than 2, but less than 4. Plato. Obviously, the number is 3. Socrates. In fact, it was pi. The McNamara fallacy. The McNamara fallacy occurs when one focuses exclusively on quantitative observations and discounts qualitative information. Socrates. Looking at your scores from your last instructor, you averaged A's on every assignment, but you have no clue what you're doing in my course. I just don't understand it. Plato. In my defense, that course was a masonry course, and I'm a professional mason. I have no idea what logic is. I can barely read. Nirvana fallacy. The nirvana fallacy is the idea that if a solution isn't perfect, then it must not be true. Socrates, I'm very disappointed in you. When asked to add 2 plus 2, you drew a picture of a flower instead of the number 4. You have a lot of work to do to improve. Plato, you misspelled disappointed. Cherry picking. A cherry picking fallacy occurs when data is chosen to support a claim while ignoring the other points of interest. Socrates, I'm looking at pairs of numbers which add to give 10, and it appears that all such pairs of numbers are positive. Plato, have you tried a negative number yet? Socrates, don't be ridiculous. Let's focus on the positive. Survivorship bias. A survivorship bias fallacy occurs when some process exists and we focus only on those which make it through the process without considering those that didn't make it through the process. Socrates, since we made our entry-level course calculus, we are seeing lower success rates in calculus, but not as low as the success rates beforehand. Plato, that's because students who aren't calculus ready are deciding not to enroll in the first place. False analogy. The false analogy fallacy determines the truth of a situation by creating an analogy to something with similar characteristics, but which might not be a perfect match. And here's a real example from back in the day. Plato, I define a human as a featherless biped. Diogenes, while holding up a featherless chicken. Behold, Plato's human. I like Diogenes. He's a fun one. And the red herring fallacy. And so a red herring fallacy is a general misdirection and comes in many forms. The sum of the squares of the legs of a right triangle will always be the square of the side opposite the right angle. Plato, I don't think so. We discussed it. Triangles are immoral, and we should not be teaching them in school. Now, circles, that's what we're talking about. Final thoughts. Whether you seek to understand truth or you wish to distort it, understanding logical fallacies will give you the tools you need. They can be used for good, they can be used for evil. Before using these techniques, it is always important to be mindful of your goals and your audience. There are some underhanded techniques to win an argument, but a win isn't always a win if you get an undesired outcome. After all, what's the point of getting something right or arguing something as correct if you just end up making everyone hate you in the end anyways? I mean, sometimes it's worth it. That said, I'll let you get to work exploring where you find logical fallacies in the real world. Good luck, folks.